Okay, so in this video we're going to talk about good and bad soldering connections and just kind of the tips for making sure you have good ones. So the first thing I want to point out is the biggest tip I can give you, the most important thing you can do to make sure you're going to get good soldering connection is making sure the tip is clean. Okay, you can see that the one on the right is nice and shiny. The one on the left is kind of dull. It's got black spots on it. Those like dark spots on it are really what you want to avoid. It comes from oxidation. And the way to prevent that is by cleaning the soldering iron. So even as I sit here holding this, you can see the tip of this one starting to darken. Okay? And the way we clean it is by just melting solder on it. Okay? So important to, when you're not using it, melt some fresh solder on it. That cleans off the oxidation. And so whenever we're not using the iron, we keep it like this, and that prevents the oxidation. When we're ready to use it, we clean this excess solder off using like one of these brass sponges. Okay, so let's talk about bad soldering connections now. So the first thing that can happen when you're soldering, so if you, instead of like putting the solder at the base of the, like if you apply the solder to the iron itself, instead of the board, you can get something messy like this. Okay, it ends up in the wrong spot, so it's not connected to the same thing, and it's not really joined to the board. Okay, so the way that we fix that is that when we're soldering, we want to make sure that we apply the heat to the base of the connection, and then we also take, when we apply the solder, instead of putting it on the iron, we put it down here where the connection is. Okay, which brings us now to our second problem. If you get too much solder, something really bad can happen. Okay, you can see here that the solder has bridged between these two rails, and this creates a short. Okay, there's one circumstance we're going to do this in our project and intentionally short out the rails. Beyond that though, you really want to avoid this. Okay, if you get too much solder and you have a jump going between the two rails, the ways that we can fix that are by either remelting it, so holding the soldering iron there, just like by the side of it, causing it to melt, and just kind of like wiping along it. Okay, that can sometimes do it. Like here, it looks like we kind of cleared up that opening. But if it doesn't work because there's too much solder, the other thing you can do is we have a tool called a solder sucker, and you would melt it and you can actually suck up the extra solder. Hopefully we can avoid that circumstance though. The next thing, when you're soldering, if you don't get the connection hot enough, and honestly I'm even having a hard time doing bad connections just because this is a really good iron, but like if we don't get it hot enough, it's gonna maybe like start to bubble up, maybe like this toward the, like up and down like that. What we are really looking for is a soldering connection that where it kind of spreads out. Okay, so, and even this one's a little extra solder on there, but this is a fairly decent connection there, a little bit extra solder because I had extra solder on the iron. But you want it to be surrounding the kind of connection, and it to be spread out, and the way that we achieve that is by getting the copper hot. And so the soldering, the purpose of the iron isn't to melt the solder, it's to heat up the copper, and then you kind of bring the solder in between the iron and whatever you're connecting and try to get it to melt there. And the stuff that you see smoking is what kind of pushes it down onto the copper. So as it melts and it gets hot enough, you can see it kind of pushing down and spreading out on the copper. You see it spreading out there, and that's what we want. This is a really nice connection right there. Okay, that's kind of what we're looking for. Let's say that you have a couple pieces next to each other. Let's say there's something right here. Okay, so we added solder to some other object here. Maybe there's another thing here too. Okay, if we have a buildup of solder like this along the rail, that's okay when we're connecting things on the same rail. What we want to avoid is here where it's jumping from one rail to the next rail. Okay, so you want to make sure you have enough solder. Okay, like this is probably even a little too much. Okay, you make sure you don't have too much. You want to make sure you heated the board up enough for it to make a connection between this leg and the board. Okay, and you want to make sure you've completely surrounded the leg with solder. Okay, so like if you only put the solder on one side, so like this one right here, I'm only going to put the solder on one side. Okay, and this one even might be okay, but it's good to make sure there's solder all the way around. So this one even ended up with solder all the way around. And the funny thing about this video that I'm making is, like, I'm not doing a very good job of messing up my soldering connections. And part of the reason why is because the tip of the soldering iron is really clean, and the second is that the soldering iron is really hot. Okay, if the soldering iron has time to heat up and you keep the tip of it pretty clean, then it's really easy to make good connections. When it's dirty and it's not hot enough, those are the points where you start to have problems with the connections.